Mr. Kopp, let's talk about those Bermudians who actually were fortunate in the first instance to own property. With the declining employment in their international business and its related knock-on effects, are there signs that Bermudians are having difficulty in servicing mortgages on both primary residences and investment properties? If so, how have the banks responded?
Thank you, buddy. Obviously, that's a hot question around, and I think it's something like the Mark Twain quote, where the reports of my death are highly exaggerated, and everybody's talking about the problems in the credit world for the banks, but quite frankly, the credit has held up surprisingly well. Obviously, there's some strains, and people are talking most about single-family mortgages, but throughout this period, people were paying down their mortgages because the payment had the principal component, so that the payments came down. A lot of these mortgages were made over the years. So I think the credit portfolios have held up much better than people will give it credit to. And of course, the banks are better prepared. They're better reserved. They have more capital. And loans in Bermuda are only half the average bank's balance sheet, unlike America or London, wherever the loans would be over 100% of deposits. So I think the banks are pretty well prepared for it. There's a lot of counseling going on. I know all the banks are working with lenders. We have very few foreclosures going on at Butterfield. We're working through with the lenders and coming up with accommodations. So we're feeling guardedly positive.
Mr. Simmons, do you think the Bermudian debt situation could lead to a housing crisis or a debt crisis? You mentioned it in your introduction.
So housing crisis leading to a banking crisis?
Debt crisis.
A debt crisis? No. Based on the numbers that I've seen, the lending by banks has decreased marginally, if at all. And that, I think, is perhaps the major determinant of whether or not there's a banking crisis, a housing crisis. Banks have a very important role to play in the recovery. Having said that, most of the banks have already overextended themselves. We need to go back to life in Bermuda in 07 and 06 and 05. And I would argue that that was not a healthy time. The amount of lending, the growth in lending since 2004 was consistently in the double digits. And I don't know that we want to get back to that place, because that leads to asset bubbles. And when asset bubbles burst, bad things happen. But to come back to your question, I think the banks have hopefully learned from the last recession, when they unnecessarily cut off recession. So they're keeping it going. It would be great if they could increase it further, but of course there are significant risks to doing so.
If I could just chime in on this one here, because I'd like to, because my military background says, when I look at something, I ask the question, what exactly is going on here? If I look at what exactly is going on in Bermuda, I do see a housing crisis that's about as going to be as bad as about the US subprime crisis, because there's an avalanche of housing that's hanging out there. The south side units down at the south side have been built, the 4 towers are complete, they're not occupied, they're only half occupied. Gilbert Lopes over in South Shore is building 125 units to add to it. That's supposed to be affordable housing. There are no buyers for those housing. With the population decline, remember that, from 68,000 down to 62,000 in this year, there's been a loss of resident population. There are therefore a lot more apartments empty. Bermuda today is probably sitting on about 3,000 unused apartments. People can carry about savings and the reserves, but that doesn't last forever. And there are still houses coming onto the market. There are still houses looking for buyers, and especially houses that are just being built. This kind of thing is what I see. It is real, but it is not talked about. And that's the point that Sir John and I have often made. Let's look at what's really happening, ask the question, what exactly is going on, and then look for that answer and verify it. And the verification is in those units over there, the unused units on the south side, and the fact that there's probably anywhere between 1,500 to 1,800 apartments and houses that have been empty since 2008.
Thank you.
We have a crisis.
Thank you. I'd like to just take a moment. If any of you have questions, can you please, on your cards, can you please raise your hand and they'll be collected. Not yet. Not yet.
The other thing is, every time you lose a foreigner, think about it, a foreign worker, he's renting somewhere, he or she is renting somewhere. What do you lose? You lose the foreign exchange that they pay for the rent, that pays the Bermudians, that then pays the servants, what about the kids' education or what?
Maybe you could answer this question then. A lot of people are confused when they hear in the media that international business is leaving, but also hear that in 2011, 64 new insurance companies incorporated in Bermuda. Please explain if this means that overall international business is expanding, shrinking, or staying the same.
Well, again, the government does not put out information enough for us to make an empirical judgment on what's taking. But from what we can gather, most of those companies were purpose companies, they called them. Whether they were sidecars to deal with a particular toxic position that the insurance company might have had, or but maybe one or two of them. And even if they were one or two or three of them, even if they got started in Bermuda because they raised the capital, one of the things that happens is they go and they create the company, and then they go looking for the capital. And it takes a long time to build an insurance operation up. But so we're not talking about any real significant growth. But every day you hear, and almost every other day you hear of some company reduce the size of the staff, and a part of them are Bermudians who are no longer earning, and part of them are foreigners who are no longer paying their rent and buying cars and getting service. And that drives our GDP south. And so, do we have growth in the international business? Or the financial service business? And Red Cobb is probably better geared in terms of what he sees things than I am. But my suspicion is that we are seeing a negative decline, because if 95% of GDP is financial services, and if the GDP is falling, it has to fall from financial services.
Well, funny you should mention that, because I have a question for Mr. Cobb. Most people would agree that tourism, while greatly diminished in relative importance to the economy, is still critical in that it provides jobs as well as some of the basic infrastructure that international business needs, that is airlift, hotels, restaurants. The banks have all taken write-downs on many of their hotel loans in the past few years. To revitalize tourism will take a significant amount of capital from local banks. What role will the banks and other local financial institutions play to help maintain and revitalize our tourism infrastructure?
That's a tough one. I know I've heard Larry and Sir John speak about how tourism is dead, perhaps, and may not be as important, but I don't think we should be giving up on it. So I do think it's an industry we need to focus on. I don't think the local banks are going to be that helpful given the capital and the risks. I would like to see some effort, though, to figure out how we build a new hotel in the short term, because I think it could send a good message. And how can the government put a package of incentives together to make that happen through payroll tax reductions or import duties, or even using gambling as an incentive to get a new hotel? Because I do think we have to keep tourism going to some degree. We can't give up on it. It does create jobs. It does support local business. So I believe it is an industry we can't give up on, but I don't see the local banks providing all the capital. Some of it's going to have to come from abroad.
I have an open question for the panel, so please jump in if you wish to answer. The government has recently floated the idea that increasing duties for all imported personal items to 35% across the board. On clothing, for example, this represents a 500% increase. Please share your thoughts on how this will affect working Bermudians and what it will do to the Bermuda economy.
I'll jump in there. We've got to distinguish between short-term solutions versus long-term solutions. The customs duty is narrow, to put it nicely. We need to broaden the tax base. Of course, now is probably not the time to do it, but we're trying to get more and more out of a rather narrow base. And of course, you're going to piss people off because the rates of duty are going to have to go up, and it's not clear that the amount collected will go up. We really need to grow up and develop a value-added tax. Some call it a sales tax, but value-added tax is better. A value-added tax would broaden the base to include services. So if you're going out for a meal, you will pay value-added tax on that. In fact, I mean, just about everything should be subject to value-added. And the good thing about that is that the rate of tax across the board could be rather low. I mean, right now we're toying with the possibility of 35% duties or 25% duties. Now, I haven't done the arithmetic, but it seems to me we're talking no more than, say, a 15% value added, possibly as low as 10, if the net is cast broad. So, I mean, I think I've heard enough of the nickeling and diming about duties. My view on the duty is that make it simple, make it consistent. Don't have exceptions for Peter and some for Paul. Consistency and simplicity and transparency, I think, are most important in any tax code.
I think I'd like to jump in on that one there because it's an interesting one. It's one I looked it up. We set our customs duty and all that sort of stuff back when Queen Victoria was on the throne. Back in 1980, when tourism was still king, the income from tourism that year was around 325 million, I think. Government expenditure in that year was around 120 million. So by taxing the tourists who are coming here in the hundreds of thousands, made sense. That changed. In 1994 and going forward, it's completely different. The people who are here now are spending completely differently, and yet we're still trying to tax the consumption of goods on the island. It's stupid. It's crazy. We're trying to extract $200 million from a thing that is producing far less money now than it was, relatively speaking, in 1980. Craig's idea of a value-added tax is right. Tax transactions, not items that cross into our borders. So we've got to think along those lines. We've got to get out of Queen Victoria's reign and get ready for King Charles III.
Thank you. We have other questions here, but since no one has filled in the cards, is there anyone who would like to give a question from the floor? Yes, please. Oh.
Would you like the microphone? This gentleman here from the bank.
Yes.
Can you tell us why in February 2011, why all three banks increased their interest rate?
It's a good question. Well, we did not increase our interest rate in February 11, let me tell you. The other two banks did. An ad for Butterfield. But let me say that the cost of doing business has escalated dramatically. You talked about those loan losses. Someone has to pay for those loan losses. Someone has to pay for the 10 people the banks have servicing problem loans. So the profitability of the mortgage business has dropped. It has not gone up.